The Selton Hill engagement took place on Friday, the 11th of March 1921. Selton is a townland about halfway between the towns of Mull and Ballinamore in County Leitrim. This is often called the Selton Hill ambush, but not by any stretch of the definition of ambush could it be classified as such. It was a surprise attack by British forces on resting volunteers in two local houses, that of James Flynn and John McCullough. At this stage, the War of Independence had been ongoing for about 2 years. Local volunteers had been drilling, raiding houses for arms, had burned the local RIC barracks, and were gradually taking over the court system in the country. That led, of course, to increasing tensions, and that forced the more active volunteers to leave their houses or to go on the run. By the end of 1920, there were about 20 of these young men in their early 20s that had come together for safety and for companionship. By now, IRA General Headquarters in Dublin were dissatisfied with the level of activity in Leitrim and Roscommon. So they seconded one Sean Connolly, who was Vice Commandant of the North Longford IRA Brigade, brought him to Dublin for a couple of weeks organisational and training, and then dispatched him firstly to Roscommon, and by mid-February he had crossed into Leitrim. He spent the first few weeks training the group of volunteers in weapons, procured some extra weapons for them, tactics and mine making. He divided the 20 volunteers into two flying columns, number 1 under the leadership of Sean Mitchell from Drumreilly, number 2 under his own leadership. On Friday, March the 4th, number 1 column under Mitchell ambushed British forces between Gowal and Carrick-on-Shannon at Shimore. It was a short engagement, during which the officer in charge of the British party, Lieutenant Wilson, was shot dead. 3 or 4 more were also injured. And from an Irish point of view, it was a short and successful engagement and was the first loss of British life during the War of Independence in Leitrim. Around this time, Connolly would have been in contact with headquarters in Dublin, and in particular with Michael Collins. And in one of the letters that survives, Michael Collins advises Connolly to do something about Mull. By that, he meant carry out some engagement that would ruffle the feathers of the RIC District Inspector Gore Hickman, who was in charge of that area. So that is probably what brought them into the Mull-Ballinamore area on this occasion. So a week to the day after Shimore, on the following Friday, which was March the 11th, Connolly and 10 volunteers of number 2 flying column left the house where they had been staying, Pádraig in the townland of Corlaska near Estlin-Bridge. It was an early morning start and about 3 or 4 miles cross-country march ahead of them, but they were carrying some heavy landmines as well. The 10 men that were with Connolly that morning were Michael Baxter from Kildoa, Bonboy, Paddy Guckin from Lisnagee, Kildahart, Jack Hunt from Attyrory, Carrick-on-Shannon, P. McDermott from Kiltygerry outside Ballinamore, Annie McPartland from Callowhill in Auchnesheelan, Joe Byrne from Currycramp in Barnacoola, 2 John Joe O'Reillys from Auchnesheelan, one with the rank of Captain from Miscon, and the other with the rank of Lieutenant from Dertincaher MacDonald, Bernie Sweeney from Tullyhusker outside Ballinamore, and Seamus Rinn from Drumcrumman in Corlean. They arrived at Selton at about 8:30 in the morning. We know that because Charlie Flynn, who was a teacher in a Doon National School, was leaving his home and saw them coming down on the hill on the other side of the valley. He didn't realise at that stage that they were actually coming to his own house. The reason for Flynn's as a destination was that Charlie's father, James, was a second cousin of one of the column's members, Lieutenant John Joe O'Reilly. So they would have presumed on a welcome in Flynn's. Apart from that presumed welcome, it was a strange and, as it turned out, a poor choice of resting place. It was along the main road between Mohill and Ballinamore, which was used daily by British forces, and it was in plain view of that road. Most importantly, it was well beneath the level of the road. There is a steep gradient from the road down to Flynn's house, so when the engagement started a few hours later, they were completely overlooked. The fields behind Flynn's house backed onto Selton Lake, which cut off the retreat in that direction. It wouldn't appear that they had posted any sentries or lookouts, and they had been warned on at least 3 occasions of their poor position. By the Flynns, by their neighbours Frank and Willie Murphy, and by Delia Manning, who worked in Murphy's shop in Gorva and had heard of their presence in Flynn's being talked about openly in the shop. They were also in plain view of 2 Protestant houses, and Protestant families would at that time have been regarded with some suspicion. To mitigate that, they posted 2 guards in the nearer of them houses, John McCullough's, which was only 50 metres from Flynn's, and they were there just to mind the McCullough family and would not appear to have general lookout duties. It was a relaxed day, breakfast, later on dinner. Some of them slept, they rested, played cards, had the crack, talked to old James Flynn, who was sick in bed upstairs, walked up to Murphy's and talked to that family. Until about 4 o'clock, they heard a gunshot from the direction of Gorva. Now, they weren't unduly worried, because their reckoning was that if the British were in the vicinity, they wouldn't be likely to advertise their presence with a gunshot. But nevertheless, Connolly did ask the volunteers to gather their gear and asked Charlie Flynn if he would go up to the road and check that everything was okay. Charlie did so and was almost immediately confronted with the lorry load of soldiers and Inspector Gore Hickman's car. They stopped. Gore Hickman interrogated Charlie Flynn, asked him had he seen any armed men in the locality. Charlie said he was on his way home from school, and of course he hadn't seen any such armed men. But Inspector Hickman had the information that there were volunteers in the locality, so he immediately took charge and ordered one of the Lewis machine guns be set up on the top of the piers at McCullough's Lane. The other Lewis machine gun was brought on the lorry down to the top of Flynn's Lane. Now, these were formidable weapons. They had a range of probably 800 metres, which was the whole valley in front of them, and they had a firing rate of 600 rounds per minute. So they were game changers on their own. He positioned 5 or 6 soldiers along the road between the top of the hill and the direction of Ballinamore, and the remainder of the 27-strong party were divided into 2 search parties, which advanced towards each of the houses. Charlie Flynn was marched at gunpoint in front of the search party approaching his house. At some stage, the firing started. According to the British, it was the Irish that fired. I would be sceptical about that, because of the poor position that the Irish now found themselves in. They now had left through the back doors of the houses and were hiding in some bushes. So they were in no position to start an engagement. It was likely that the British soldiers along the road, on seeing movement in the bushes, opened fire. The firing probably started while they were quite close to Flynn's house, otherwise Charlie Flynn would not have survived. The second search party going down McCullough's Lane were now in a position to fire across behind Flynn's house. So there were immediate casualties on the Irish side. Lieutenant John Joe O'Reilly and Seamus Rinn were shot dead immediately. Jack Hunt was shot in the leg and incapacitated. Sean Connolly ordered his men to retreat and almost immediately was seriously wounded himself. So there were now 5 volunteers attempting to escape through the fields. Michael Baxter and Joe Byrne were shot very quickly. Bernie Sweeney was hit 3 times in the hand, in the heel, and most seriously in the groin. As he ran, he fell into a deep drain, but retained consciousness and had the presence of mind to pull his gun with him and to pull some rushes over his head to conceal himself as best he could. From his position in the drain, he could see Captain John Joe O'Reilly pull the pin from a grenade, and as he was about to throw it, he was hit with a bullet, fell to the ground with the grenade in his hand, which detonated with catastrophic results. Andy McPartland, meanwhile, was doing best. He got into a drain and moved in the direction of the road initially, and then parallel to it in another drain, and eventually escaped behind Murphy's and back to Aughnasheelin. Meanwhile, the 2 volunteers in McCullough's had been either forgotten about or were not known to exist. They moved out through the back of the house and down the fields towards the edge of the lake, where they hid in some rushy drains until after the soldiers had left. They escaped more or less by the way they had arrived that morning, and walked about 3 miles that evening to the house of Thomas McLaughlin in the townland of Kilmacshirwell near Castlefore in Fena Parish. Next day, they split up, with Paddy Guckian heading back towards his home country of Kilnagross and P. McDermott heading towards Aughnasheelin. Back at Selton, the soldiers searched for a short period and eventually carried the dead volunteers back to the lorry. Inspector Gore Hickman returned to Flynn's, interrogated Charlie again, this time a bit more roughly, put him against the wall and threatened to shoot him, but in the event he didn't. He was arrested though, and along with the dead volunteers and the injured Sean Connolly and Jack Hunt, were taken by the soldiers first to Mohill and then to the jail in Carrick-on-Shannon. Sean Connolly died that night at about 11 o'clock, according to British reports. Jack Hunt and Charlie Flynn were seen next day by the doctor in Carrick-on-Shannon. Bernie Sweeney, in the drain, was fortunate in that the cold water probably stemmed his blood flow. It was now approaching darkness, about 6:30 to 7 o'clock. Neighbours across the road, McGrail's, were fothering cattle and thought that they heard a shout down in the fields. So young Frank McGrail, who was about 16, went to the neighbouring house of Guckian's, where P and Johnny Guckian, along with 2 other neighbours, Willie Murphy and Patrick Woods, were discussing the day's events. All 5 crossed the roads down into the fields, heard another shout, and almost immediately found Bernie Sweeney, who by now had pulled himself out of the drain. They brought Bernie up to Michael Murphy's house, which was about 100 metres away. This was a Republican house. Michael himself had been chairperson of Leitrim County Council, chairperson of Leitrim GA, and chairperson of South Leitrim Sinn Féin. Frank McGrail, being the youngest, was sent to Fena to get Father Dunn, the Fena curate, who lived close to the Abbeys in a house where St. Collins National School is presently situated. He reluctantly came to Murphy's and attended to Bernie Sweeney, and it was fairly quickly realised that he couldn't be kept in Murphy's because the British soldiers would be back early next morning. So P. Guckian volunteered to take him by horse and trap along the main road through the village of Fena and down a little slip road called Tully Lane to the house of his cousin John Sweeney in the townland of Killaneen. He didn't stay there very long, probably because the Sweeney connection would have been too risky, and was moved on about a mile further down the road to the house of P.J. Dolan in the townland of Ballyduff or Tumluscan. That night, Dr. Dolan from Ballinamore came out and tended to his wounds, and the following night, Saturday night, he was brought again by horse and trap to the house of John Cull in the townland of Tullibon in Auchnacheelan. The last part of that journey was on a door acting as a stretcher, the door being taken from Tullibon Old National School because the terrain on the way to Cull's was too rough for even the horse and trap. Over the next number of weeks, he was nursed back to health, both in Cull's and in John Red O'Rourke's in the townland of Selton. He made a good recovery and rejoined the column early in May. Later on, Jack Hunt was court-martialed and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. But the truce, of course, occurred on July the 11th, exactly 4 months later, followed by the treaty on the 6th of December. So Jack was released in January of 1922. On the Monday following Selton, there was a military inquiry in Carrick-on-Shannon, which was an inquest, really. And after that, the bodies of the dead volunteers were released. Prayers were said in the church in Carrick-on-Shannon firstly, and then the families took each of the bodies back to their home parishes. Over the next couple of days, they were buried with, of course, huge attendances at their funerals. Sean Connolly in Clonbrony in Ballinallee, Joe Byrne from the church in Barnacoola to Muhull Graveyard, Michael Baxter from Bon Boy Church to Kilnavart Graveyard, while the two John Joe O'Reillys and Seamus Rinn had their funeral services in Ballinamore and burial afterwards in a single plot in Auchnacheelan Graveyard in what is now called the Republican plot. And so ended Leitrim's bloodiest Friday. The Selton Hill ambush that never was an ambush. In national terms, it ranks second only in terms of Irish lives lost to the Clonmult engagement in County Cork, which had occurred 3 weeks earlier, where 12 volunteers lost their lives. Nevertheless, Selton was a serious military setback to the nationalist effort, not only in Leitrim, but nationally as well.